Today we are discussing the India-US relationship, and this comes in the wake of the two leaders holding a virtual meeting which comes ahead of the India-US 2+2 dialogue. We will have Prime Minister Narendra Modi meeting US President Joe Biden in a virtual summit, and we will also have the India-US dialogue which is taking place in Washington DC this year. Mr. Sareen, when you see this activity which is happening on the India-US front, how much weightage does this lend to a relationship which we have seen of late getting really strong?
I think this is quite important what is happening. Also a little unusual because normally the 2+2 meeting in a sense prepares for a meeting between the two principals. But this time the meeting of the two principals, that is the Prime Minister of India and the President of the US, is happening just on the eve of the 2+2 meeting. Now, it is possible that it could set the tone for the 2+2 meeting, which could then take things forward and further ease the path for the two principals, or it could be that there are other issues beyond the 2+2 which are likely to be discussed. I think a bit of both is likely to happen. Also, the growing, in a manner of speaking, the areas of divergence which both sides are working to reduce. We are not exactly seeing eye to eye on the Ukraine conflict. While India would agree that what has happened in Ukraine, India has not endorsed the Russian invasion, but India has not taken the same stand which the United States has taken, and that is where the divergence is coming. India's option is that let's talk about diplomacy, let's talk about keep lines of communication open. So we are taking that line, while the American line is diametrically opposite to the line we are taking. So that is a issue of some divergence between the two sides. But rather than recriminations, I think what both sides are trying to do is narrow down the differences, try and coordinate better. And in a manner of speaking, that shows you the strength of the relationship. At the same time, I think it also should inform everybody in the world that whatever noise is being made in the American media, that noise is not really being reflected by the US administration, which is trying to work its way with India.
Mr. Sareen, we also see that the statement which has been issued by the White House has said that President Biden will continue our close consultations on the consequences of Russia's brutal war against Ukraine and mitigating its destabilizing impact on global food supply and commodity markets. We've also seen the Ministry of External Affairs here issuing a statement where they have said that the two leaders will review ongoing bilateral cooperation and exchange views on recent developments in South Asia, the Indo-Pacific region, and global issues of mutual interest. Do you feel, when we look at both the statements, that both countries are trying to find convergence? And as you explained, the issue of Ukraine sees both India and the US taking different views, but despite that, would you say that there is an attempt for convergence rather than divergence?
Ukraine is not the first time that there is a certain divergence in our views. Let me try and explain this. See, even on Afghanistan, both India and the United States wanted the same thing in Afghanistan. There was no divergence between what India wanted and what the US wanted in Afghanistan. The only divergence was on how to get what we wanted out there. In Ukraine, for example, India has already said it in public forums, in international forums, at the United Nations, that we stand for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. So exactly what the Americans stand. We have said that we do not endorse the violence in Ukraine and violence must immediately stop. Exactly what the Americans want to happen. So what we want is the same thing as the Americans want. The only difference is in the kind of tools and instruments which are to be used and the means which are to be used to reach that point. And that is where the divergence is coming. Now, the end objective is clear and there is a divergence on the means to be used, I'm sure that that divergence can be narrowed down. There might not be complete congruity between what our position is and what the American position is, but I don't think that there will be a complete dichotomy between what we want and between what the Americans are wanting. I would suspect that we can move forward on issues like Ukraine simply because the objective is the same. And I think the effort from both sides is to be able to work together, even though we might not entirely agree on the measures which the other side might be adopting or might be advocating.
Mr. Sareen, we also see that India and the United States will hold their fourth annual Plus Two dialogue in DC. We have External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar and the Defense Minister both in the US at currently. And a number of issues will be high on agenda like climate, public health, building supply chains. How important do you think is this regular 2+2 defense and the foreign ministry dialogue which is taking place between the two countries? How important is this in not just sustaining this relationship, but also, as we have discussed, when we have differences in the relationship, it also sustains it and taking it forward?
I think it's extremely important. I think this is just a one step lower than a summit level meeting. And what we are having now is both a summit level meeting, albeit virtual, and the 2+2. So it shows you the level of engagement between the two sides. So I think it's extremely crucial, number one. Number two, the breadth of agenda which is there. You name the issue, that issue is being discussed. From defense, security, climate, international politics, you name it, it's all on the table. And that tells you the sheer stance of both the countries engaging each other. And that's important because India does not want and India cannot be typecast in only a particular region. While our own immediate region is of course critical, but to say that, okay, we will only engage with India insofar as the Indo-Pacific is concerned or South Asia is concerned, that's not acceptable to India. And I think the Americans have understood it, and that is why on global issues, there is this level of engagement which is taking place. And as far as the future of the relationship between India and the United States is concerned, what I mean to say is that there was a time when many of the countries in the world would look at India only from the prism of South Asia. For a certain amount of time, the Americans looked at India only from the prism of China or of Pakistan or of some other place. Now that prism has changed. Now it's a global prism from which they look at India and the role that India can play in what are called the global issues. So I think that's a huge change which has come about between India and the US and how the two sides engage with each other. And meetings like the 2+2, in fact, the entire format of 2+2 has been devised as just one step lower than the summit, but with both the defense and the foreign ministers as part of it to discuss all the critical issues going forward.
Mr. Sareen, we've also seen India abstaining at almost a dozen United Nations resolutions on the Ukraine invasion, and India has had to diplomatically walk this tightrope between its relations with Russia and its relations with the US. Do you feel that this is something India has been able to explain or put out successfully to the global community, that while it understands the global implications of the Ukraine war, among other things that are happening, India is also taking steps and positions which are in its own interest? Has the outreach or the message gone out successfully?
I think it's a mixed bag, and we should admit that it's a mixed bag. In the sense that we have tried to explain our position, there are the more sober and sensible elements in the Western world have understood where we are coming from, what we are trying to say, what we are trying to do. I think there is a level of understanding for our compulsions, for our interests, and how we are trying to defend ourselves from some of the trends which are emerging. So there is that. But there is also the noise which is coming. For example, in the American media, much of it is politically driven rather than based on any level of sense or any real analysis. So one is that factor. The other thing is that every country in the world, look, if India and the Americans are getting together and working closely together, it's not because there's suddenly a love fest between the two sides. All countries get together, work together because they see a convergence of interests. And between the Indians and the Americans, or the Indian and the Western world, there is convergence of interests, not only on global issues, but on political issues, on ideological issues, on a range of issues. There are differences as well. But despite that, I think the convergences are more important. And because our interests are converging, we are engaging with each other at levels which we have not done in the past, when our interests did not entirely converge. So for anyone to expect that India will overnight simply turn around from its own interests and work in the interests of somebody else, I think that's quite mindless. That's not going to happen. Now, what are India's interests? I think we need to be clear on that. We have very close political and diplomatic relations with the Russians. We might not have endorsed their actions, but that does not mean that we are ready to say goodbye to the Russians. We have certain amount of dependence on the Russians. Insofar as the defense sector is concerned, a lot of our defense equipment and supplies come from Russia. So that is something which we cannot ignore. There is this whole issue of India buying oil from Russia, but then it's an open offer. Anybody can beat the price at which Russians are giving oil to us. We're more than happy to not buy Russian oil and buy oil from elsewhere. But nobody is willing to give us that deal. And we have very serious issues of poverty, which we are trying to address, of cost of living of our people, of the welfare of Indians. And if we can get oil cheaper, and that's not going to last permanently, maybe for a month, 2 months, 3 months, and it's not as though we are buying the bulk of Russian oil. The oil which we are buying from Russia is a minuscule amount compared to what some of the Western countries are buying. So for anyone to say that India is fueling the Russian war machinery, it's utter nonsense. We are doing no such thing. In fact, the Europeans and the other countries aligned to the West are buying much more oil and gas from Russia than we are. And just as they cannot turn the tap on the Russian oil and gas supplies, even we can't turn off the tap on Russian defense supplies. It cannot happen overnight. And yet, if you look at the long-term trend, India has been diversifying even its defense purchases. So I think there is that understanding in the West, and this is exactly what we are trying to explain to our interlocutors in the Western world. Some of them are understanding it and appreciating our problems. Others are being a little bloody-minded about it, but I suppose that's just the way it is. They will, of course, try and wean us to their side, which is, again, nothing extraordinary or unusual about it. Every side tries to do that, just as we will try to do it. So I don't take anything amiss in that. But ultimately, it will be a function of diplomacy on where we reach an equilibrium in our relationship on this particular issue. And I'm sure we have very experienced diplomats handling these negotiations. And we have a certain amount of wisdom with which we will approach these matters. I don't think there will be any knee-jerk reaction or response from the Indian side or from the other side. So I expect to work out eventually. I don't foresee much of a problem.
And in the coming days, we will continue our discussions on the India-US relationship, and we will follow Prime Minister Modi's virtual summit with the US President and the US-India 2+2 dialogue. With these comments, we bring today's discussion to an end. Thank you.